They said the sun would make her confess, but the woman tied to the rock never said a word. The heat rolled off the desert in waves, 110 degrees if it was an inch, and still she stood there with her back straight, wrists bound against the rough stone, eyes steady on the people who had decided her fate without ever asking her name. Dust Hollow had seen its share of strangers, but none like her. Not with that quiet defiance that made folks uncomfortable in ways they couldn't explain. Someone had taken the silver necklace from her neck earlier, a small thing with a worn engraving, and tossed it into the dirt like it meant nothing. But she had watched it fall, and in that moment something in her gaze changed. Not fear, not anger, something older, something patient. The townspeople whispered among themselves, each version of her story growing sharper, darker, until it no longer resembled truth at all. Just a shape they could all agree to fear. No one stepped forward to question it. Not even the sheriff, leaning against the post with his hat pulled low, pretending the weight of the badge didn't press against his conscience. A boy kicked dust toward her boots and laughed, though the sound didn't carry far in the dry air, swallowed by the stillness that seemed to stretch across the entire street. Then came the sound of hooves, slow and measured, not the kind that rushed into trouble, but the kind that had already seen it before. A rider drifted into town like he belonged to the horizon itself, coat worn, hat low, eyes scanning without hurry. He didn't ask questions right away, didn't reach for his gun, didn't even look at the crowd first. Instead, he dismounted, boots touching the ground with a soft thud, and walked past them all as if they weren't there. It was the necklace that caught his attention, half buried in the dust, glinting faint under the harsh light. He bent, picked it up, brushed it clean with his thumb, and for just a second, the world around him seemed to pause. Something in that small piece of silver held his gaze longer than it should have, longer than anything in that town deserved. Behind him, the murmurs quieted, replaced by attention. No one could quite name. The woman on the rock watched him now, not pleading, not hopeful, just waiting, as if she already knew what came next and was measuring him against it. The rider turned at last, eyes lifting toward her, and there was no anger in them, no rush, just a calm that didn't belong in a place like this. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the heat without effort, low and certain, asking a question so simple it unsettled everyone who heard it. And just like that, the story the town had built began to crack before a single rope had been cut. No one answered him at first, not because they did not hear the question, but because they did not know how to answer it without unraveling everything they had already decided. The rider stood there, the silver necklace resting in his palm, his thumb tracing the worn engraving as if it spoke a language only he remembered, and the silence stretched long enough for the wind to carry dust between their boots. The sheriff cleared his throat, shifting his weight, trying to gather authority that did not seem to belong to him anymore, and said the woman had been accused, that witnesses had spoken, that the town had agreed. But even as he spoke, his voice lacked something steady, something certain. The rider did not look at him, not yet. He just asked again, slower this time, who saw her do it, and the words settled heavier than before, pressing into the crowd until a few men glanced at each other, unsure of where the story had begun and where it had been shaped to fit their fear. The woman on the rock did not move much, but her breathing had grown shallow under the weight of the sun, and still her eyes remained clear, fixed somewhere between the rider and the horizon, as if she had already stepped beyond the reach of what they could do to her. A woman near the front crossed her arms tighter, insisting she had heard it from someone else, that it was known, that it had to be true. But when the rider finally lifted his gaze toward her, she faltered, her certainty slipping under the quiet weight of his stare. He closed his fingers around the necklace for a moment, then opened his hand again, letting the silver catch the light. And something in his expression shifted, not anger, not surprise, something deeper, something remembered. He took a step forward, then another, each one measured, unhurried, until he stood close enough to see the marks left by the rope against the woman's wrists, close enough to hear the faint sound of her breath carried through the heat. The crowd stirred, a ripple of unease moving through them, as if they sensed something changing that they could not control. The sheriff spoke again, louder now, warning the rider not to interfere, saying the matter was settled, but the words sounded thinner than before, like they no longer held the same weight in the air. The rider stopped just short of the rock and tilted his head slightly, studying the woman for a brief moment. And she met his gaze without hesitation, no plea, no fear, only that same quiet patience. Then he did something no one expected. He removed his hat and held it against his chest, not as a gesture to the town, but to her. And in that small motion, something shifted again, something the crowd could feel but not name. He turned back slowly, his eyes moving across the faces gathered there, one by one, as if memorizing them the same way she had. And when he spoke this time, his voice was softer, but it carried farther, asking not what they believed, but what they knew. And the difference between those two things began to open like a crack in dry earth, widening with every second. No one dared to answer. The crack widened in ways no one could see, but everyone could feel, like the ground shifting just enough to make a man question his footing, and still no one stepped forward to claim what they knew, because knowing required standing alone, and Dust Hollow had forgotten how to do that. The rider let the silence breathe, did not rush it, did not fill it, because he understood something the others did not. That truth did not need force, it only needed space. The necklace rested in his open hand again, the silver catching sunlight in a way that seemed too bright for something so worn, and he glanced down at it for just a moment before speaking, quieter now, almost to himself, but loud enough for the nearest few to hear, saying he had seen this mark before, long ago, in a place where people did not speak quickly and did not judge faster than they listened. A few in the crowd shifted, uncertain, because his words carried a weight that did not belong to rumor or fear, but to memory, and memory had a way of making men uncomfortable when it did not match the story they had chosen. The sheriff stepped forward then, trying to gather what little control he had left, saying the town could not run on doubt, that decisions had to be made, that order depended on it. But the rider finally turned his eyes toward him fully, and there was something in that look that made the rest of the sentence fade before it finished. It was not anger, not even challenge, just a quiet certainty that made excuses sound thin. Behind them, the woman's knees bent slightly under the heat, not enough to fall, just enough to show the strain her body carried, and the rider noticed. Because he noticed everything that mattered and ignored what did not. He stepped closer to the rock, slow enough not to startle, deliberate enough that no one could mistake his intention, and the crowd reacted the only way it knew how, with tension, with held breath, with hands hovering near belts, but never quite moving further. One man muttered that this was not his concern, that strangers should not interfere, but the words lacked conviction, as if even he did not believe them anymore. The rider stopped within arm's reach now, close enough to see the faint lines of dust on her face where sweat had tried and failed to fall, close enough to see that her eyes had not lost their clarity, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, not familiarity, not recognition, something steadier, something built on the simple act of seeing another person as they were. He lowered his hand and gently placed the necklace against the rock beside her, not putting it back yet, just letting it be close, as if returning it required a moment that had not come. The sheriff spoke again, softer this time, warning him that he was stepping beyond his place, but the rider did not look back. Because place meant nothing when the ground itself had already begun to shift. Instead, he reached up slowly, his fingers brushing the rope just enough to feel its tension, not pulling, not cutting, just understanding, and the entire town seemed to lean into that moment, waiting to see if he would go further, waiting to see if someone would stop him, but no one moved, because something in the air had already changed, and deep down, they all felt it, the quiet realization that whatever happened next would not belong to them anymore. The moment held, stretched thin like a wire pulled too tight, and still no one stepped in, not the sheriff, not the men who had spoken so loudly before, because something in the rider's stillness made action feel heavier than silence. His fingers rested against the rope as if he were reading it, understanding the story it told without a single word, and then he lowered his hand again, not yet acting, not yet breaking what had been done, because even he seemed to know that this was not only about freeing a woman. It was about revealing something the town had buried beneath its own certainty. He turned slightly, just enough to face the crowd without leaving her side, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet weight. asking who had first brought the accusation, who had spoken the name that turned suspicion into judgment, and the question moved through the people like wind through dry grass, unsettling, shifting, exposing the spaces. Between them, a man near the back cleared his throat, saying he had heard it from another, that it came from the trading post. But when the rider's gaze found him, he faltered, pointing instead towards someone else, and the chain began to unravel, one uncertain voice leading to another, until the origin of their certainty dissolved into nothing more than echoes. The woman on the rock watched it all without speaking, her eyes following the movement of doubt as it passed from face to face, and there was no triumph in her expression, only that same steady patience, as if she had seen this before in other places, other times. The sheriff removed his hat then, wiping his brow, not because of the heat but because something inside him had begun to shift, something that made the badge on his chest feel heavier than it ever had. The rider glanced back at the necklace resting against the stone, then gently picked it up again, holding it between his fingers so the engraving caught the light for all to see. And he said he knew this mark, that it belonged to a family who had once offered shelter without asking questions, who had given water without demanding a name, and the words settled over the town. Like a memory they had never lived but suddenly understood. A woman in the crowd lowered her gaze, her earlier certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to recognition of what had been lost in their rush to judge. The rider stepped closer to the woman once more, raising the necklace toward her, but stopping just short of placing it back, as if waiting for something unseen to settle into place. The air felt different now, not lighter, but clearer, like the moment after a storm when the dust has not yet settled but the sky has already changed. He reached again for the rope, this time with purpose, his movements slow and deliberate, giving every person there the chance to speak, to object, to reclaim the certainty they had held so tightly. But no one did, because the truth had already begun to take shape in the silence they could no longer ignore. And as his fingers tightened just enough to begin loosening the knot, the town realized that what they had tied to that rock was never just a woman. It was their own reflection, and it was starting to come undone. The knot gave slightly under his fingers, not enough to fall apart, just enough to show it had never been as unbreakable as it looked. And that small shift echoed louder than any shout across the silent street. The rider paused there, not rushing the moment, letting every eye and dust hollow settle on what was happening. Because once something begins to come undone, it cannot pretend to be whole. Again, the woman's head tilted just a fraction, her gaze lowering briefly to the rope as if acknowledging the change, then lifting back to the horizon, steady as ever, as though freedom was not something she chased but something she waited to meet halfway. The sheriff took a step forward, then stopped, his boots pressing into the dust without sound. And for the first time since morning, he looked not at the rider, but at the woman, really looked, as if trying to see past the story that had been handed to him. The rider loosened another turn of the rope, slow, careful, making sure nothing snapped or startled, his movements carrying a kind of respect that made the act feel less like defiance and more like correction. Someone in the crowd muttered that this should not be happening, that rules had to mean something, but the words drifted away before they could land, because even the speaker seemed unsure what those rules had been built on. The silver necklace still rested in the rider's other hand, and now he lifted it again, holding it closer to the woman's line of sight, not forcing it, just offering its presence. And her eyes flickered to it for the first time, a small movement, almost missed, but enough to confirm something unspoken between them. He studied her for a second longer, then finally spoke directly to her, his voice low, asking a question no one else could hear clearly, and she answered just as quietly, her words carried away by the dry wind. But whatever passed between them seemed to settle something in him, something that had been uncertain until that moment. He nodded once, almost to himself, then returned his attention to the rope, working through the final tightness with the same patience, the same care, until the tension gave way completely and the binding loosened against the stone. The crowd shifted again, not with outrage, not with protest, but with something heavier, something closer to recognition of a line that had been crossed long before this moment. The sheriff removed his hat fully now, holding it at his side, and though he said nothing, the gesture spoke louder than anything he could have offered. The rider stepped back just enough to give the woman space, not reaching to pull her free, not assuming what she would do next, because this was not his moment to claim. The rope hung slack now, no longer holding, no longer defining, and for a brief second, the entire town seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she would fall, if she would speak, if she would leave, but she did none of those things right away. Instead, she remained there, steady against the rock, as if reminding them all that what had been done could not be erased in a single gesture, only acknowledged, and in that quiet pause, Dust Hollow began to understand that the man who had loosened the rope had not just set someone free, he had forced them all to face what they had chosen to bind in the first place. The rope hung loose now, swaying slightly in the dry wind, no longer holding her, yet she did not step away, not immediately, as if the weight of what had just happened needed a moment to settle into her bones before her body could follow. The rider stood a few feet back, giving her that space without turning away, his presence steady, not claiming, not leaving, just there, like a line drawn quietly in the dust. The town waited, though no one would admit it, every eye fixed on her in a way that felt different now, not sharp with judgment, but heavy with something closer to uncertainty. She moved at last, not quickly, not dramatically, just a small shift as her hands came free from where the rope had pressed them, her fingers flexing slightly, as if remembering something they had not needed to do for a long while. The silver necklace rested in the rider's hand still, and when she finally turned her head toward him, there was no surprise in her eyes, only recognition of a moment that had already passed between them. He stepped forward once, slow and deliberate, and held the necklace out, not placing it on her, not assuming that right, just offering it back. She looked at it for a brief second, then lifted her hand and took it, her movements calm, almost ceremonial, as if the small piece of silver carried more than memory, more than identity, something tied to a story neither of them needed to speak aloud. Behind them, the sheriff shifted again, his voice quieter now, uncertain, saying the town had acted on what it believed was right, that they had followed what they were told, but even as he spoke, the words sounded hollow, like something repeated too many times to still hold meaning. The rider did not answer him, did not argue, because the moment had already moved past that kind of exchange. Instead, he watched as the woman slipped the necklace back around her neck, her fingers steady despite the heat, the silver resting once more against her skin where it belonged. She lifted her gaze then, not to the rider, but to the crowd, and for the first time, there was something different there, not anger, not forgiveness. Something quieter, something that asked a question none of them were ready to answer. A few people lowered their eyes. Others looked away entirely, the weight of her gaze too much to meet now that the certainty was gone. The rider turned slightly, his attention shifting from her to the town, not with accusation, not with challenge, just a calm presence that made the space feel smaller, more honest. A man near the edge of the crowd stepped back. Then another, the movement subtle at first, but spreading, like something unseen passing through them. No one spoke to stop it, no one called them back, because deep down, they understood that what had been done could not be defended in words anymore. The woman took a step forward then, away from the rock, her footing steady despite everything, and the sound of that single step carried farther than it should have, echoing in the silence that followed. She did not look back at the rope, did not acknowledge it again, because it no longer defined anything worth holding on to. The rider watched her for a moment longer, then lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, not in victory, but in something quieter, something that belonged to understanding. And as the first few townspeople began to turn and walk away without a word, Dust Hollow felt the shift fully, not as a loud reckoning, but as a quiet unraveling that would not be easily forgotten. The dust did not settle right away. It drifted slowly through the street, as if even the wind was unsure which direction to take, and the people of Dust Hollow moved the same way, uncertain, quiet, no longer bound together by the story they had shared only moments before. The woman walked forward without haste, each step measured, her posture unchanged, not weakened, not hurried, just steady in a way that made the space around her feel different, as if the ground itself had shifted to meet her. The rider remained where he was for a moment, watching, not following yet, his eyes tracing the path she chose, as if making sure it was truly hers and not something shaped by the eyes still lingering on her back. A man near the general store lowered his hat, pretending to adjust the brim, but it was the only way he could avoid meeting her gaze as she passed, and others followed in their own quiet ways, stepping aside, turning away, giving space they had not offered before. The sheriff stood still in the center of it all, his badge catching the sunlight, but no longer reflecting authority, only weight, and he seemed smaller somehow, as if the silence had taken something from him that could not be easily reclaimed. The woman paused then, not far from the edge of town, and for a brief second, it seemed like she might leave without another word, without looking back, but instead she turned slightly, her eyes sweeping across the people one last time, not searching, not accusing, just seeing. And in that moment, the town felt exposed in a way no accusation could have done. The rider stepped forward now, closing the distance between them by a few quiet strides, stopping at her side but not in front of her, not blocking her path, just present, as he had been from the beginning. He did not speak immediately, and neither did she, because whatever needed to be understood had already passed between them in smaller moments, in glances, in silence. The necklace rested against her chest once more, catching the light with each breath she took, a small detail, but one that seemed to anchor everything that had just happened. Behind them, the town continued to thin, people drifting back to their places, though nothing about those places felt the same anymore, and even the wooden buildings seemed to hold the quiet differently, as if they had witnessed something they would not soon forget. The rider finally spoke then, his voice low, asking where she would go next, not as a demand, not as an assumption, but as a simple question, and she answered just as quietly, her words carried by the wind, naming a place beyond the hills where the land stretched wide and the air did not carry the weight of other people's judgments. He nodded once, as if that answer made sense in a way deeper than direction, and for a moment, it seemed like that would be the end of it, two strangers parting after a single shared moment. But then she looked at him again, longer this time, and there was something new in her gaze, something that had not been there before, not gratitude, not obligation, something closer to recognition of a path that had just begun. And as the wind picked up slightly, lifting dust into the air once more, the town behind them faded into the background, leaving only the quiet question of what comes after a moment like this. When silence has already said everything that mattered, the wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and something older, something that did not belong to Dust Hollow. And for the first time since she had stepped away from the rock, the woman slowed, not because she was unsure, but because she had reached the edge where the town ended and the land began to open. The rider stood beside her, close enough to be present, far enough not to claim her path, and the silence between them felt different now, no longer heavy, no longer tense, but steady, like something settling into its rightful place. Behind them, the town had quieted completely, no voices rising, no footsteps rushing, just the distant creak of wood and the soft shuffle of people returning to lives that would not feel the same again. The sheriff remained where he was, his figure smaller in the distance, his gaze fixed not on them anymore, but on the empty space where the ropes still hung loose against the rock, as if trying to understand how something so certain had come undone so quietly. The woman lifted her hand briefly, adjusting the necklace at her collar, her fingers brushing the silver as if confirming its presence, and then she looked out toward the horizon, where the land stretched wide and unforgiving, yet honest in a way the town had not been. The rider followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly against the brightness, and for a moment, it seemed like he might turn back, like his place was still tied to the street behind him. But he did not move, not yet. She spoke then, her voice low, carried lightly by the wind, telling him that the land ahead did not forget, that it remembered everything but judged nothing, and there was no weight in her tone, no bitterness, just a quiet truth offered without expectation. He listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture shifted, something that suggested he understood more than he let on. A horse tied near the edge of town stamped softly, the only sound breaking the stillness, and the rider glanced toward it briefly before returning his attention to her. She took another step forward, then paused again, not turning back this time, but waiting, as if leaving room for a choice that was not hers to make. The dust lifted around her boots, swirling lightly before settling again, and the horizon seemed closer somehow, as if the distance had shortened in the presence of what had just passed. The rider exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat, a small motion, but one that carried decision in its quiet certainty. Behind them, a door closed somewhere in town, the sound sharp against the still air, marking the end of something that would not return. The woman did not look back, did not acknowledge it, because whatever had been left behind no longer belonged to her. She stepped forward once more, this time without pause, her path clear, her pace steady, and the rider remained where he was for just a second longer, watching her go, measuring the distance not in steps, but in meaning. Then, without a word, he began to move, not rushing to catch up, not falling behind, but walking in a line that ran parallel to hers, close enough that the silence between them remained, open enough that it did not bind either of them. And as the town faded further into the background, the space ahead seemed to expand, carrying with it a question that neither of them needed to speak, but both had already begun to answer. The land stretched wider with every step they took, the town behind them shrinking into something that no longer held shape or sound, just a memory carried by dust and silence. And neither of them looked back, because there was nothing left there that needed to be seen again. The woman walked with a steady rhythm, not fast, not slow, her presence grounded in a way that matched the open earth beneath her, and the necklace at her collar caught the sun with each breath, a quiet reminder of something returned, something restored without words. The rider kept his distance at first, not out of hesitation, but out of respect, his path running parallel to hers like two lines drawn by different hands that had somehow found the same direction. The wind moved through the grass in soft waves, carrying no judgment, no whispers, just the simple sound of the land being itself. And in that space, the weight of what had happened in Dust Hollow began to fade, not forgotten, but placed where it belonged, behind them. After a while, she slowed again, not stopping completely this time, just enough to let him draw closer without calling him forward. And when he did, their steps aligned for a few quiet moments, side by side, the distance between them no longer marked by uncertainty. He glanced toward her briefly, not searching for answers, just acknowledging her presence, and she met that glance without hesitation, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if whatever needed to be understood between them had already settled into place. The horizon ahead shimmered under the heat, miles of open land with no clear path, no marked road, only direction shaped by instinct and choice. And for the first time, the rider seemed to let go of something unseen, something tied to where he had come from. He spoke then, his voice low, asking her name, not because he needed it, but because the moment called for it. And she answered simply, the sound of it carried lightly by the wind, grounding her presence in something that belonged to her alone. He repeated it once under his breath, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement, and then he offered his own, not as introduction, but as balance, a small exchange that required no more than what was given. They walked on without adding to it, because names did not change what had already been understood, they only gave shape to it. Far behind them, Dust Hollow continued in its silence, the rock still standing where it always had, the rope still hanging loose, but no one returned to tighten it again. No one spoke of what had happened in the same way, because something had shifted that could not be undone. Out here, under the wide sky, there were no crowds to convince, no voices to outmatch, only the quiet measure of a person's actions against the land that witnessed them. The woman adjusted the necklace once more, her fingers resting on it for a brief second before falling back to her side, and the rider noticed, not commenting, not questioning, just carrying that detail with him as they moved forward. The sun dipped slightly, the light softening just enough to stretch their shadows longer across the ground. Two shapes, moving side by side without crossing, without pulling, simply continuing. And in that quiet, where no one watched and nothing demanded explanation, justice did not arrive with noise or force. It settled gently, like dust after wind, leaving behind only what could not be denied. that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is not draw a weapon, not raise a voice, but stand still long enough for the truth to reveal itself, and then walk forward without needing